Andrew Amos, thanks again for your time. How important are these two reports? Because it's now becoming a fair body of work saying this sort of thing.
Oh, indeed. Look, Andrew, I think in a few years' time, we're going to look back at these reports as incredibly important, particularly the Cass review. If what we've heard is true, the final version of the review is going to confirm what critics have been begging medical authorities to look into for several years. And they'll start reversing the worst harms being done to confused kids and their families. So measures like ending puberty blockers and preventing social transition at schools should effectively end the transgender treadmill, which was all but ensuring a lifetime of difficult and dangerous treatment for increasing numbers of people. But I also expect the Cass review to trigger a fairly severe process of self-examination by the medical profession, which has allowed this to happen.
Because, of course, the same findings would have to apply to children here getting treated for supposedly being transgender, wouldn't they?
Oh, no question. Very, very similar. Look, there are small differences in treatment models between the UK and Australia, but we all use essentially the same blueprint of gender-affirming care, and it's largely based on a model developed in Holland. So the key feature of all of them is the same: the automatic, unquestioning affirmation of self-reported gender identity. So the Dutch study that you mentioned by Roy and colleagues suggests affirmation has been extremely effective at trapping kids into a lifetime of care who otherwise would return to normal in a few years.
Yeah, it's sad, isn't it, when you think, the blurtings out of someone who's, in this case, in the Dutch case, 11 years old, is treated like, oh, yes, you're right, let's start the care now, instead of giving them time to explore and come to a realisation they're actually happy with what they are. It traps them in their first instance, and it's much harder for them to say, oh, maybe I made a mistake, I'm okay, actually. So what is happening here in Australia that we need to fix? How come we don't have an inquiry for a start into all this?
Well, look, we've been a few years behind Britain in a lot of ways. They were ahead of us in implementing the model. And what that meant was they saw the big increase in numbers before we did. And then, of course, they saw the problems emerging from that big increase in numbers before we did. So a few years ago, the biggest institute, the Tavistock Institute, which was doing all of the gender affirming care in England, basically generated a lot of reports of poor practice, essentially. They weren't really checking or mental illness in the patients that were presenting with gender confusion. And that causes something called diagnostic overshadowing, technical term, but it basically just means if you're looking so intently for gender identity, you miss the things that are actually causing the problem. So we're behind them, we're catching up.
And in short, the kind of things that we're missing out in diagnosing these children, or that the so-called experts are missing out on, what warning signs are there?
Well, look, one of the problems, they weren't looking for those warning signs. So there were a number of whistleblowers who were basically saying at the Tavistock Institute in the UK, they weren't really checking for the sorts of mental illnesses that overlap with gender identity. So particularly things like autism, neurodiversity, as they're starting to call it now, but also personality disorders, mood disorders like depression and anxiety. So if you're not looking for those things and you're predisposed to think everything is gender identity, it then becomes very easy to say, well, every patient that comes in the door has gender identity, has an issue with gender identity, and therefore that's what we're going to focus on. What you were mentioning before about the behaviour is also very true. If you reinforce the idea that someone has a gender diverse identity, you're essentially making it more likely they'll continue to express those ideas. It's very what we call reinforcing. Very basic part of human nature is if you give people attention for something, they're very likely to keep on doing it. And that was really the way people were being trapped in the transgender treadmill. Young kids were coming in, they were confused.
Particularly if they are.
People would they treat them very nicely.
They are from difficult homes as well. It is a way to get attention and care and love and all that kind of stuff. It's very sad. Andrew Amos, I'd like to thank you again for the work that you've been doing here. It's been an unpopular kind of field to be in for a while, but I think history is coming your way very, very fast. Thank you so much for your time.